Okay, chat. Here we are with our final figure in our investigations into modern political thought. We are taking a look at Edmund Burke's masterwork, his 1790. It's actually technically a letter, though it was, 250 manuscript pages long. It's titled "The Reflections on the Revolution in France," and it's the kind of text that takes a little more background, I guess, than some of the other stuff we've been reading. Chronologically, we're jumping backwards. So we just took a look at Marx. We read the Communist Manifesto of 1848. Now we're jumping back to 1790. And we are investigating a figure who is good God, most frequently, most often associated with another modern political ideology, distinctly modern political ideology called conservatism. So we've looked thus far at a number of different isms. We've looked at absolutism, we've looked at liberalism, we've looked at socialism and capitalism. And now we're going to take a couple days to talk about conservatism. Conservatism as a political movement really takes its beginnings in the late 18th century. Much of it is viewed as a response to the events of the French Revolution. And sort of part and parcel of that is the fact that Burke's reflections, which were issued in the year after the revolution began, became such an enduring work and really such an enduring statement of the conservative worries about the excesses of um, of modern political thought, and in particular, the radical potential that sort of sits within the social contract theories that we've been looking at, the ideas of human nature that you find in a guy like Rousseau, and in particular, the radical ideas about legitimacy and rights of resistance that we've been looking at all semester long. So, just by way of some background, I want to situate Burke and the reflections in their historical context, and I also want to situate Burke with respect to something called conservatism, and then we'll take a look at just a couple of passages from the reflections today to kind of get you guys on your way. So one thing to note about Burke is that Burke was not a conservative. And what I mean by saying that Burke was not a conservative is that there was no such thing as conservatism when Burke was writing. In fact, Burke was a Whig, Whig. He was a Whig, which was one of the two main political parties that had emerged as England moved to a ministerial system of politics in the 18th century. There were the Whigs, who occupy what we would today think of as the political left. So they tended to be more pro-reform. They tended to support the prime minister's office. They tended to support wider suffrage, things like that. So the Whigs would have been the traditionally liberal party. And then on the other side are the Tories, which in the 18th century, today we think of them being conservative, but of course conservatism doesn't exist at the time. Tories means, they are they take very seriously the claims of legitimacy voiced by the monarchy, voiced by the church, right? So they tend to be high church Anglicans, and they tend to strongly prefer a sort of hierarchical system, according to which you have, a House of Lords who have certain titles to rule by birth, and things like that. So they tended to support more traditional forms of English society. The thing about Burke being a Whig, the kind of surprising thing about Burke being a Whig then is that it becomes to be so closely associated with conservatism. And if you look at his political record, so Burke spent his life as a politician, as an MP. He In fact, it's pretty much the only profession he'd never known. By the time he's writing the reflections, he'd been in office for over 30 years. He was one of the most um, well-known MPs and one of the most well-known public speakers, one of the best-known orators in England. And ironically enough, his reputation was staked on several historical events that we would think of as being on the quote unquote left or liberal side of things. So Burke famously supported the side of the colonists in the American Revolution. Now, to be clear, he didn't support everything. He didn't, for example, send them assistance or anything like that. But he thought that the colonists had legitimate grievances against both the Parliament and the Crown. And in fact, he thought that their separation was potentially within their right. So he took the side of the colonists against his own government in the 1770s. And then he spent the entire 1780s in an effort that took over a decade. He spent the entire 1780s going after a guy named William Hastings, who was the head of the East India Company. And the East India Company was essentially a parliamentarily, no, I'm sorry, it was chartered by the king, and it was given basically sort of exclusive access to the trade zone that was India. Essentially, what it was a sort of quasi corporatist entity whose job was to colonize, not really colonize, to basically extract wealth on behalf of England from India. And their methods were very rapacious. They pillaged and they stole and they killed and they did all sorts of sundry vile things. And when Burke read of these things, he almost immediately took the side of the oppressed. He almost immediately took the side of the Indian people, again, against his own government. And he brought Warren Hastings to trial. He spent much of the 1780s making public speeches at the trial of Warren Hastings. This was a trial that he pursued unsuccessfully. Ultimately, the people did not sufficiently empathize with the plight of the English people did not sufficiently empathize with the plight of the Indian population to actually convict Hastings of anything. And it kind of ruined his career because he lost and because he spent so much political capital in this pursuit. So in 1789, when the French Revolution, excuse me, when the French Revolution begins, there's a lot of sentiment in England that said this would have been on the Whig side, in particular the so-called New Whigs, so the sort of increasingly radical wing of the Whig Party. A lot of these guys were coming out and saying, listen, what's happening in France right now, it might look a little excessive, but the reports that we're getting are, reports, potentially that the king is issuing or that are otherwise prejudiced um, against the revolutionaries. And really, what we should do is we should view the efforts of the French, we should view the efforts of this new revolutionary force as being in some ways consistent with our own revolutionary process. Remember, the English had undertaken their own revolution in 1688, the so-called Glorious Revolution. It had pretty officially switched the relative positions of king versus parliament in the order of sovereignty. And it had inaugurated a number of reforms. Like Britain had changed a lot in the previous 100 years. So, for example, it was England prior to the Act of Union in 1706, and it was part of the revolutionary settlement that brought Scotland and other parts of the UK under the auspices of Britain. There had been a series of financial revolutions in the 1690s that had updated and renovated the English economy in a number of ways. And again, the ministerial system had grown up in the 18th century. So they're looking at this and they're like, listen, we've come a long way in the last 100 years. We've come a long way. We've been guided by these liberal principles of, consent of the governed, expanding suffrage, the rights of man, increasing the rights of working class people, et cetera, et cetera. And all the French are doing is sort of following in our footsteps. So we should, if anything, support them. And we should see ourselves as in a kind of common cause with them. And so of an acquaintance of Burke's writes him a letter in 1789 that asks him to make a public statement. Because again, Burke was kind of an elder statesman at that point. And it was thought that a sort of a public statement from someone as prominent as Burke, a public statement supporting the rights of the revolutionaries would go a long way in pushing English public sentiment uh, towards their side. And what he got in return was not the document that he anticipated. Burke did not take the side of revolutionaries. Very specifically, he did not think that what was happening in France was at all similar in spirit or in fact to what had happened in England in 1688. And instead, he wrote this document, which very much condemns the French Revolution and condemns it on grounds that would quickly come to be associated with conservatism. So that's a little bit of background of the letter. And this is kind of why it was surprising that Burke issued this letter and why it made such a huge impression on the reading public. One other thing I just want to talk about very quickly is with respect to conservatism. So to say that Burke is a conservative is, I think, accurate, but it's only partially accurate. And the reason I say it's only partially accurate is that the word conservatism and the word conservative, like the word liberalism and the word liberal today, has a very specific connotation in our own sort of public discourse. So in the same way that when we say liberal, we kind of conjure up images of like Nancy Pelosi or Hillary Clinton or whatever. Likewise, when we say conservative, we conjure up images of, members of our own, I say our own, the American Republican Party. So currently, Donald Trump is the official and unofficial head of the Republican Party. So by a not in particularly great leap of discursive logic, we could say that Donald Trump is our leading conservative. Now, the problem with this is that the Burkean conservatism that we're going to look at, and whatever it is that Trump supports, these things are not in the same practical universe of things. So we have adopted a somewhat unusual idea of conservatism, which is sort of anyone that falls on the political right. But it turns out that there are different styles of thought on the political right in the same way that there are on the political left. Right? So like liberals who, as we've seen, liberals who think that the purpose of the state is to protect private property. We put them on the left, but we also put socialists and communists on the left, despite the fact that communists consider liberals to be their like immortal enemy, and think that these sort of property-oriented theories of government are inherently oppressive and things like that. So, despite the fact that many factions on the left not only oppose one another but actually contradict one another, likewise on the right, we have sort of conservatism, we have reactionary thought. We have all sorts of species of thought on the right. And the thing we're going to be looking at, conservatism, does not in any way, shape, or form describe all of them. In fact, I would say today, particularly with respect to sort of American movement conservatism, the word conservatism only really describes a relatively small number of figures on the American right. So I just want to preface that by saying, like, if you go into this and you're like, Burke's a conservative, and therefore, his view on this or that thing is going to be in keeping with Trump or whatever, you're going to seriously misunderstand what we're doing here. Okay, so I just want to focus really on just a couple of passages today. There's this one in particular that we'll sort of start with, and then we'll take a look at a second one, and it mostly will serve as a kind of a pathway into the readings for you to do today and for us to talk about tomorrow. Okay, so again, he's being asked, how do you feel about the French revolutionaries? Do you support this? Do you not support this? What do you think we should do? Aren't you, after all, a friend of liberty? So here's what he says in response to this idea. This is a key paragraph here on 7. I flatter myself that I love a manly, moral, regulated liberty, as well as any gentleman of that society, be he who he will. And perhaps I have given as good proofs of my attachment to that cause in the whole course of my public conduct. So the key phrase here, the interesting phrase here, is this here: I love a manly, moral, regulated liberty. So we've talked about liberty a number of times over the course of the semester. For somebody like Hobbes, it simply refers to the absence of external impediments. For somebody like Rousseau, it's autonomy, right? For Montesquieu, it's to do with living under moderate power. Here, Burke attaches 3 very interesting words to the idea of liberty. And in particular, I want to focus on this last one, regulated. a regulated liberty. So normally, and ironically enough, especially if we're thinking about the political right in America today, normally we think about regulation and liberty as being in some ways opposed to one another, right? So if someone says, I want to cut back on regulations, I want to cut back on the regulatory state, et cetera, what they mean is like, listen, we can't be free anymore. And the reason we can't be free anymore is because we have too much red tape and too much regulation and too much, the Federal Register is too long and all this sort of stuff. But here, Burke seems to suggest that liberty isn't just being free to do what you will, to do what you list, the way that Hobbes would phrase it, but rather that liberty is something to do with the condition of being regulated. Um, let's just continue. I think I envy liberty as little as they do any other nation, but I cannot stand forward and give praise or blame to anything which relates to human actions and human concerns on a simple view of the object, as it stands stripped of every relation and all the nakedness and solitude of metaphysical abstraction. Now, here are two great words that show up a lot for Burke. And anytime Burke doesn't like something, anytime he thinks that we're being led not by politicians and practically minded, experienced people, but rather by philosophers and men of letters and people with no practical experience, anytime he thinks that's happening, he says that we're being swayed by metaphysics or by metaphysics speculations. And so metaphysical abstractions he thinks are bad. They almost always mislead us. So this is interesting. So he says, I can't give praise or blame to anything which relates to human actions and human concerns on a simple view of the object as it stands stripped of every relation. This next word here is the key word, circumstances, with which some gentlemen pass for nothing, given reality to every political principle its distinguishing color and discriminating effect. The circumstances are what render every civil and political scheme beneficial or noxious to mankind. So if we think about sort of these great political philosophical terms like liberty or equality, right? Liberty in the abstract, I mean, sure, it's fine. Equality in the abstract, sure, it's fine. But liberty in every circumstance isn't fine. So, for example, children, we don't want children to be free. We don't want children to have liberty. In fact, actually, the process of parenting just refers to an activity which is inherently interested in the restrictions of the freedoms of children. You want to release them into freedom slowly and gradually, and only after they have certain habits and certain forms of discipline built up. Likewise with teaching, right? So, like if I came into a classroom and I'm like, well, here we are, you paid a lot for these classes, just do whatever you want. After all, freedom is good. Well, we don't want to be free in that way in the classroom. And even if we go down a level of abstraction, so something like free speech, well, everyone likes free speech, everyone supports free speech, but free speech in like every circumstance isn't good. So, for example, if someone got up in front of a church congregation and they're like, "Listen, in the service of free speech, instead of talking about God or whatever, I'm going to talk about physics." Or instead of talking about God today, I'm actually going to spend an hour praising the virtues of devilry and witchcraft. Right. So we don't expect the pastor to go up and engage in free speech. In fact, we want him to engage in a particular kind of speech. Likewise in the classroom. So if I got up in front of the classroom, I'm like, well, today we're going to cover Hobbes, but instead I'm going to cover thermodynamics, this is a class on modern political thought. But what if instead of modern political thought, what if we spent the next 6 weeks, examining Holocaust denial or something like that? In both cases, we would think that this is an abuse of some kind, that even though free speech in the abstract is good, these particular contexts, according to these particular circumstances, free speech is not a good thing. So Burke's like, enough about liberty, enough about equality, enough about all of these abstractions. I don't care about abstractions anymore. I don't care if the French are free. I want to know in what ways they are free. I want to know to what ends they are putting this freedom. The circumstances are what render every civil and political scheme beneficial or noxious to mankind. Abstractedly speaking, government as well as liberty is good. Yet could I, in common sense, 10 years ago, have felicitated France on her enjoyment of a government, for she then had a government, without inquiry that what the nature of that government was or how it was administered? And we can all agree that government in the abstract is good. We all want to be governed. right? We all want there to be stability in place, but like the circumstances make a big difference. If the government is tyrannical, if the stability is the stability that comes from everyone living in a kind of universal dread, then they aren't good. Is it because liberty in the abstract may be classed amongst the blessings of mankind that I am seriously to felicitate a madman who has escaped from the protecting restraint and wholesome darkness of a cell on his restoration to the enjoyment of light and liberty, right? Just because freedom is good doesn't mean we should free criminals, doesn't mean we should free people who aren't capable of being free. Am I to congratulate a highwayman and murderer who has broke prison upon the recovery of his natural rights? This would be to act over again the scene of the criminals condemned to the galley and their heroic deliverer, the metaphysic knight of the sorrowful countenance. And in this case, he's talking about Don Quixote. So already we can see sort of what Rousseau is taking aim at. He thinks there's something about the French Revolution, much more so than the American Revolution, which is dangerously motivated by abstractions. So while we know the American Revolution, we know the Declaration, and we know the role that the Declaration plays. Then the Declaration is a very abstract document. What often gets less talked about is the fact that the Declaration only comes in 1776, after the revolutionary effort itself was a year old, and after the tumult that led to it was over a decade old. And a lot of the debates in colonial America weren't about like freedom, they weren't about natural rights. A lot of these debates were about like, listen, here's what the charter specifies. Here's what Parliament has said about the rights of Englishmen. Here are a set of grievances that we have that relate specifically to the patterns and activities of government that have been in place in England for hundreds of years. So it was only at the very end of the American effort of independence that it becomes abstract in the way that we see in the Declaration. Before that, it was very practically oriented. It was oriented around minutiae, the minutiae of trading agreements, the minutiae of tax agreements, the minutiae of representation. It was really, in many ways, a kind of fight over the rules. And so what Burke is looking at in France is he's saying, like, listen, in France, they're not really fighting over the rules. In France, what they have in mind is that there's something fundamentally screwed up about the entire French way of life, about the French monarchy, but also about the French church, also about the French nobility, about the entire French economy. All of it is based on this rotten basis that men like Rousseau and Voltaire have identified. And so the French Revolution, rather than an act of essentially secession or independence that left much of the governmental infrastructure in place, the French Revolution kind of tore the whole thing out root and branch, right? And for Burke, the danger of basing a revolution on abstractions is that at some point you kind of forget what the rules are. At some point you kind of forget who you are. At some point, in an effort to undertake this kind of complete and total radical transformation, you sort of lose the basis upon which an orderly transition can take place. Okay, I'm going to ask you guys to do a little bit more work than what I've asked you to do in the past. And I want you to take a look at this passage that starts here on 14. So on 14, Burke begins a sort of a 15-page commentary on a speech that had recently been given to something called the Revolutionary Society by a guy named Richard Price. So Richard Price had come in and given a very sort of new Whiggish, very left-leaning commentary, left-leaning meaning radically leaning commentary on the French Revolution. And in particular, Price had advanced these three principles. One, he had advanced the idea that according to 1688, according to the English experience, it was the right of the people to choose our own governors, that according to 1688, it was the right of the people to cashier them, meaning to sort of punish them for misconduct, and according to 1688, it was the right of the English people to frame a government for ourselves. And so all Price is saying is that the French have taken these essentially English principles and they've applied them to the case of France. So what's interesting here is that the debate between Burke and Price, the debate between Burke and his other Whig colleagues, yes, it's a debate about France, but it's also a debate about what happened in 1688. What happened in 1688 and what principles were established in 1688. And so I want you to take a look at how Burke responds to each of these charges, these three rights that Price claims that the revolutionaries of 1688 claimed for themselves and for the English. This discussion takes, let's see, yeah, cashiering, let's see. Yeah, it's about a 20-page discussion. That's as far as we're going to read today. I want you to read up through page about 38. And I just want you to be ready to discuss more closely tomorrow essentially what arguments Burke makes in response to each of these points from Price. And what we'll do is when we look at each of these arguments, we'll kind of pull the idea of conservatism and a conservative approach to governance out of those. All right, we'll talk tomorrow. Bye.